Darius Langston hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Not the kind of sleep where your mind actually rests. Just short naps on a stiff office couch interrupted by phone buzzes and the low hum of servers in the next room. His eyes felt gritty, his shoulders tight like they'd forgotten how to relax. But he didn't complain. He never did. At 42, he'd built his company from a garage startup into a respected name in clean energy. Not by waiting for permission, but by showing up, staying sharp and doing the work even when no one was watching. That morning in San Francisco had been the kind of win most executives only dream of. After months of tense negotiations, he'd finally closed a major acquisition, a solar tech firm with patents that could accelerate his company's grid storage solutions by years. The handshake in the boardroom had been firm, the champagne flutes clinked just right, and the smiles around the table were genuine for once. Still, Darius didn't linger at the after-meeting lunch. He thanked everyone, excused himself politely, and headed straight for the airport. There was no time to celebrate, not yet. Back in Atlanta, his team was already prepping for the next phase, and he needed to be there before the sun rose on the East Coast. He'd booked first class weeks ago, standard practice for him on long flights. Not because he liked luxury, but because those few extra inches of legroom and the promise of a hot meal meant he might actually catch a couple of hours of real rest. His assistant had handled everything: seat assignment, meal preference, herb-crusted beef with roasted vegetables, his go-to, even the car waiting at arrivals. All Darius had to do was show up, sit down, and let the plane carry him home. The drive to SFO was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the black sedan, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and red. He scrolled through a few emails, then put his phone away. For once, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He thought about his mother, who used to tell him, "You can't pour from an empty cup," every time he worked through a weekend. He smiled faintly. She'd be proud, he hoped, not just of the deal, but of how he'd carried himself through it, with patience, with integrity, without losing his humanity in the process. At the gate, he moved through security with practiced ease. No fuss, no flash. He wore a dark charcoal suit, slightly wrinkled from the day's wear, but clean and sharp enough. His carry-on held a change of clothes, a well-worn copy of a James Baldwin essay collection, and a noise-canceling headset that had seen better days. He didn't draw attention to himself, and most people didn't notice him, just another tired businessman heading home. Boarding began, and he waited until his route was called. As he walked down the aisle of the wide-body jet, he nodded at the flight attendants who greeted him with the kind of polite neutrality reserved for frequent flyers. His seat was by the window, exactly as requested. He stowed his bag, adjusted the seat back, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in days, his shoulders dropped an inch. The cabin filled steadily, a couple arguing in hushed tones over vacation plans, a young woman with headphones on, eyes closed, already retreating into her own world. An older man in a tweed jacket carefully arranging his reading glasses and a paperback mystery novel. Normal people, ordinary lives intersecting for a few hours at 35,000 feet. Darius liked that about flying, the temporary democracy of it. Up here, titles didn't matter. Everyone breathed the same recycled air, waited for the same drinks, hoped for the same smooth landing. A flight attendant approached, mid-50s, silver streaks in her neatly pulled-back hair, name tag reading L. Carter. She offered a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" "Just water, please," Darius said. "And thank you." She returned with a chilled bottle and a glass. Efficient, professional. He appreciated that. No unnecessary chatter, no forced cheer. Just service done right. As the plane taxied down the runway, he leaned his head against the window and watched the city lights shrink below. The engines roared, the wheels lifted, and for a moment the weight of the past week seemed to fall away with the ground. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest. He knew the meal service would come soon. He'd eat, maybe read a few pages, then try to sleep for a couple of hours before descent. He'd flown this route dozens of times. He knew the rhythm. The gentle hum of the cabin, the soft clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversation fading into silence as night settled in. It was predictable, safe, a rare pocket of calm in a life that rarely slowed down. But tonight, something felt off, not in a dramatic way, just a subtle shift in the air, like the quiet before a storm no one sees coming. He couldn't place it. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. Or maybe it was the way Elle Carter had glanced at him just a second too long when she handed him the water. Not unkindly, just assessing. Like she was trying to figure out if he belonged. He brushed it off. He'd dealt with that look before, in boardrooms, in hotels, in airports across the country. Sometimes it was curiosity. Sometimes it was doubt. He'd learned long ago not to let it live rent-free in his head. He'd proven himself too many times to count. His work spoke louder than any assumption ever could. Still, as the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off, he felt a quiet tension coil in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. Just fatigue. Just the aftermath of a high-stakes week. He reached for his water, took a slow sip, and waited for dinner to arrive. His pre-ordered meal. The one small comfort that would signal it was okay to finally let go, even for a little while. Outside, the sky was endless and black, dotted with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber. The world below disappeared. And for now, Darius Langston was just a man on a plane, hoping for a hot meal and a few hours of peace before the next chapter began. The wheels touched down in Atlanta with a soft thud, then a steady roll as the plane taxied toward the gate. Outside, the sky was still dark, just past 5 in the morning, but the city was already waking up. Streetlights glowed through a light haze and distant headlights traced slow lines along the access roads. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred, zipping bags, checking phones, stretching limbs stiff from hours in cramped seats. But the man in 2A didn't move right away. He sat perfectly still, eyes open, hands resting on his knees. His expression gave nothing away, but inside his mind was already working, sorting facts, replaying moments, weighing what had happened against what should have. He wasn't angry in the loud, explosive way people expected. His anger was quieter, deeper, the kind that settled into your bones and demanded action, not noise. He'd spent the entire flight wide awake, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he refused to let the moment pass without understanding it fully. When the seatbelt sign finally clicked off, he stood slowly, gathered his things, and waited for the aisle to clear. Most passengers rushed off, eager to reclaim their time, their plans, their lives on solid ground. He let them go. He wasn't in a hurry. In fact, he walked deliberately toward the front of the cabin where the lead flight attendant stood by the exit, offering polite goodbyes with that practiced airline smile. She saw him coming. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes. A pause before she spoke. "Have a great day, sir," she said, voice smooth as ever. He stopped a few feet away. "I'd like your name and employee ID, please." The request was calm, direct, not aggressive, but it landed like a stone in still water. She blinked once. "Is there a problem, sir?" "I just need your name and ID," he repeated, voice even. "For my records." She hesitated, then glanced toward her colleague, who quickly looked away. After a beat, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small laminated card. She read off her name, Elle Carter, and a 7-digit number. He committed both to memory, nodded once, and walked off without another word. Outside, the air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and wet pavement. A driver held a sign with his company's logo. He slid into the back seat, leaned his head against the headrest, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to think. Back at his downtown office an hour later, the building was nearly empty. Just a few security guards and the overnight IT crew. He bypassed the elevator and took the stairs to the 3rd floor, needing the movement to clear his head. Inside his office, he flipped on a single lamp, dropped his bag on the desk, and poured himself a glass of water from the cooler in the corner. Then he sat down and opened his laptop. First, he pulled up his travel itinerary. There it was, confirmed weeks in advance. First-class seat, herb-crusted beef entree, special meal request logged through his assistant. No ambiguity, no room for error. Next, he reviewed the airline's published service standards for premium cabin passengers. Clear language about meal guarantees, substitution protocols, and customer equity. Everything pointed to a straightforward breach, but he didn't stop there. He plugged in the small lapel camera he always wore during travel, a habit born from years of navigating spaces where his presence was sometimes questioned. The footage was grainy but clear enough. He watched as the flight attendant told him the beef was gone. Then, minutes later, as she served the same dish to two other passengers farther down the aisle. He noted the timestamps, the sequence, the lack of explanation. Then he sent a brief, neutral email to the two passengers he'd exchanged glances with during the incident. Polite, professional, just asking if they'd be willing to confirm what they saw. Both replied within the hour. Yes, they remembered. Yes, it happened exactly as he described. He didn't post anything online, didn't call a reporter, didn't rant to friends over drinks. That wasn't his way. For him, accountability wasn't about spectacle. It was about structure, about making sure systems worked fairly for everyone, not just those who looked a certain way or spoke a certain tone. By mid-morning, his executive assistant arrived, coffee in hand, ready for the usual Monday chaos. She found him already deep in a spreadsheet, cross-referencing flight crew assignments, catering logs, and contract clauses. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just set the coffee down and said, "You need anything else?" "Pull the airline contract," he said. "The full corporate travel agreement. And get me the contact for their head of client relations." She nodded and disappeared. 10 minutes later, she returned with a printed copy and a name. Elena Ruiz, Senior VP of Strategic Accounts. He picked up the phone. The call was scheduled for that afternoon. He spent the hours before preparing, not with anger, but with precision. He laid out every detail, the booking confirmation, the service failure, the witness accounts, the video. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply presented the facts as they were, like pieces of evidence on a table. When the video call connected, Elena Ruiz appeared on screen, sharp-eyed, composed, wearing a navy blazer and a calm expression. She opened with pleasantries, but he cut gently to the point. "I'm not here to complain," he said. "I'm here to understand how a confirmed meal guarantee failed, and why two passengers received a dish I was told was unavailable after I'd pre-ordered it weeks in advance." She listened, nodded, offered the usual corporate script. "We deeply regret any inconvenience. Our team strives for excellence. Mistakes can happen during high-volume service." He let her finish. Then he said this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and it reflects a deeper issue with how service is delivered or withheld based on assumptions. Her expression flickered. Not defensiveness exactly, more like surprise that he'd named it so plainly. "I'm giving your team 48 hours, he continued, "to conduct an internal review, acknowledge the failure, and propose a meaningful corrective action. Not a voucher, not a generic apology. Real accountability." She paused. "And if we don't?" He looked her straight in the eye, not with threat, but with quiet certainty. "Then I'll have no choice but to terminate our corporate travel contract, effective immediately, and I'll share my findings with our partners who also fly with you." The line went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Understood." He ended the call, leaned back in his chair, and stared out the window at the Atlanta skyline. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, but also clear. Because this wasn't really about a meal. It was about respect, about being seen as who he actually was, not who someone assumed he might be based on a glance. And if the system wouldn't correct itself quietly, then he'd use the leverage he'd earned to make it listen. Later that evening, alone in his apartment, he heated up leftovers and sat on the balcony. The city hummed below, cars, distant sirens, the occasional laugh from a neighboring balcony. He thought about all the times he'd been asked to prove himself in rooms where others walked in already believed. This wasn't the first time, wouldn't be the last, but maybe, just maybe, this moment could be a turning point, not just for him, but for others who'd been handed the vegetarian plate when they'd ordered the beef. He didn't know what the airline would do in the next 48 hours, but he knew what he would do, stand by his word. Not out of ego, but because fairness wasn't a luxury, it was the baseline. And if you had the power to demand it, you had the responsibility to use it. The night air cooled. He finished his food, rinsed the plate, and went inside. Tomorrow would bring answers, and whatever came next, he'd meet it the same way he always had. With quiet resolve, clear eyes, and no apologies for expecting to be treated like everyone else. 48 hours came and went. The airline's response arrived not with a phone call, but with an email. Polished, impersonal, and wrapped in corporate velvet. It thanked him for his valued partnership, expressed sincere regret for any perceived service gap, and offered a complimentary first-class voucher for two as a goodwill gesture. There was no mention of the meal discrepancy, no acknowledgement of the witness accounts, and certainly no indication that anyone had looked into what really happened on board that flight. He read it once. Then again, then he closed the laptop and sat very still. It wasn't anger that rose in him this time, it was disappointment. Not just in the airline, but in the predictability of it all. They'd chosen the easy path, placate, deflect, move on. As if a voucher could erase the quiet humiliation of being told you don't qualify for what you paid for, while watching others receive it without question. As if fairness could be bought back with a discount on a future flight. He stood up, walked to the window, and watched rain begin to fall over the city. Atlanta in spring often did this, sudden showers that came without warning, washing the streets clean before vanishing as quickly as they arrived. He liked that about the city. It didn't pretend to be perfect. It just kept moving forward, even when things got messy. But he wasn't here to admire the weather. He was here to act. Within the hour, he drafted a termination notice for the corporate travel contract. Not a dramatic letter filled with accusations, just a clean legal document citing breach of service standards and failure to uphold agreed-upon terms. He copied his legal team, his CFO, and the head of operations. Then he hit send. The ripple was immediate. His company moved over 200 employees across the country every month. Flights, hotels, rental cars, all booked through that single airline partnership. Canceling it meant scrambling for new vendors, renegotiating rates, retraining staff. It was a logistical headache. But it was also a statement. And sometimes, statements needed to cost something to be heard. But he didn't stop there. What most people didn't know, and what the airline certainly didn't expect, was that his firm, through a private equity arm he helped manage, held a minority stake in a regional catering company that supplied meals to several major carriers, including the one he'd just cut ties with. It wasn't a controlling interest, but it was enough to request an internal audit, enough to ask questions. He called the catering company's CEO, a woman he'd worked with for years, known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce loyalty to her staff. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He simply laid out what happened. The confirmed meal, the sudden unavailability, the inconsistent service, the lack of accountability. Then he asked, "Is this how your team is being directed to manage inventory? Or is something else going on?" She listened in silence. Then she said, "I'll look into it myself." 2 days later, she called back. Her voice was tight. "We pulled the catering logs for that flight," she said. "There were enough beef entrees for every first-class passenger who ordered it. No shortage, none." He didn't say, "I told you so." He just thanked her. That was the confirmation he needed. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, made by someone on that crew in that moment for reasons they might not even fully understand themselves. And choices like that, when left unchecked, become culture. And culture, once set, is hard to undo. So he made another call, this time to the airline's chief operating officer, a man he'd met once at an industry conference. They'd exchanged business cards and a few polite words about sustainability in aviation. Now he spoke plainly. "I'm not asking for an apology," he said. "I'm asking for accountability. Your crew failed basic service standards. They lied about inventory. They treated passengers differently based on appearance. And when given a chance to make it right, your company offered a voucher instead of integrity. That tells me everything I need to know." There was a long pause on the other end. Then the COO said, "What do you want us to do?" "Review the entire cabin crew from that flight," he replied. "Not just the attendants, supervisors included. If your own protocols were violated, then your own people must face the consequences. Not because I want them punished, but because your passengers deserve consistency, honesty, and equal treatment, every single time." He didn't ask for names, didn't demand public firings. He simply insisted that the system do what it promised to do, uphold its own rules. A week later, the airline quietly let go of the entire cabin crew assigned to that flight. Not for one bad meal, as some headlines later tried to spin it, but for documented failures in inventory reporting, inconsistent service delivery, and violation of internal equity guidelines. The decision came from within, after an internal investigation confirmed what he'd already known. News of the contract cancellation leaked first through business circles, then to trade publications. Some called it an overreaction. Others called it long overdue. A few industry insiders whispered that this was the first time a black executive had used corporate leverage this way, not for publicity, but for principle. He didn't give interviews, didn't post about it on social media. He simply moved forward. His team secured a new travel partner, one with stronger diversity training and transparent service metrics. The transition was smooth. Productivity didn't drop. The world kept turning, but something had shifted. Inside the airline, training modules were updated. New protocols required meal inventory to be verified by 2 crew members before service. Bias response scenarios were added to onboarding. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for him, the real victory wasn't in the terminations or the contract switch. It was in the quiet message it sent. That excellence isn't optional and fairness isn't negotiable. That when you hold power, real earned power, you don't use it to dominate. You use it to correct. One evening, weeks later, he found himself back at the airport boarding another flight. Same suit, same carry-on, same tired eyes. As he walked down the aisle, a young flight attendant, early 20s, dark skin, name tag reading T. Ellis, did a double take. Then she smiled. Not the practiced airline smile, but a real one. "Mr. Langston," she said softly once the other passengers were settled. "I just wanted to say, thank you." He looked at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For making it so people like me don't have to prove we belong up here," she said. "Before, I'd get looks, doubts, little comments disguised as jokes. Since everything changed, it's been different. People listen. They respect the uniform." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "You earned your place," he told her. "Not because of me. Because of you." She smiled again, then turned to check a seatbelt. He sat down, buckled in, and stared out the window as the plane prepared for takeoff. Outside, the runway lights glowed steady and bright. Inside, the cabin hummed with the quiet energy of ordinary people heading somewhere important. He thought about how change rarely comes with fireworks. Most of the time it arrives in small moments. A withheld meal, a quiet conversation, a decision made not for show, but for rightness. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it echoes further than you ever imagined. The engines roared. The plane lifted. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. Not because he'd won, but because he'd stayed true. And in a world that often rewards noise over integrity, that was enough. Weeks passed, and the story that had stirred quiet conversations in boardrooms and airline lounges began to fade from headlines. There were no press conferences, no viral videos, no dramatic courtroom scenes, just a ripple that moved through the industry like a slow current. Felt more than seen, but real all the same. For the man at the center of it all, life returned to its usual rhythm. Early mornings, strategy calls, site visits to solar farms baking under the Georgia sun, late-night emails that never quite ended. He didn't bring up what happened. Not in meetings, not at dinners, not even with his closest advisors. It wasn't pride that kept him silent, it was principle. He'd acted because it was right, not because it would make a good story. But stories have a way of finding their own path. One afternoon, while reviewing grant applications for a clean energy nonprofit he quietly funded, he came across a proposal from a small aviation training program at a historically black college. The program aimed to prepare students, many of them first-generation college attendees, for careers in flight operations, cabin management, and ground logistics. The budget was tight. The ambition was huge. And tucked into the final page was a line that made him pause. "We believe the skies should reflect the people who live beneath them." He approved the full funding request that same day. Not as a reaction, but as an investment. If the industry was going to change, it wouldn't just be through policy updates or firings, it would be through new voices stepping into roles where they'd once been told they didn't belong. He didn't attach his name to the donation. Just a simple note, for the next generation who deserve to be seen. Meanwhile, the airline quietly rolled out its updated crew training. New modules focused not just on service speed or safety checks, but on unconscious bias, equitable resource distribution, and de-escalation through dignity, not authority. Veteran attendants grumbled at first, calling it overcorrection, but newer crew members, especially those who'd long felt invisible in their own uniforms, spoke up in support. One internal survey showed a 30% increase in staff confidence reporting service inconsistencies without fear of dismissal. That number meant more to him than any apology ever could. Back in his office, he added a new clause to every corporate travel agreement his company signed from that point on. Any verified instance of discriminatory service or preferential treatment based on appearance, race, or perceived status will trigger an immediate contract review. It wasn't punitive. It was preventative. A quiet line in the sand that said, "We expect better and we'll walk away if we don't get it." He never spoke publicly about the incident. When a business magazine reached out for a feature on executive influence in customer equity, he declined. "This isn't about me," he told his assistant. "It's about systems working the way they're supposed to." And that was the truth. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted fairness to be normal, not exceptional. Still, the impact lingered in unexpected places. One evening, while waiting for a delayed flight in Chicago, he sat near a gate where a young black woman in a crisp airline blazer was calmly managing a chaotic boarding process. Passengers were frustrated. The weather had grounded half the airport, but she remained steady, clear, and kind. When a man snapped at her about his seat assignment, she didn't flinch. She listened, corrected the error, and offered a sincere apology for the confusion. The man's anger melted into embarrassment. She handled it like someone who knew her worth didn't hinge on his mood. As he walked past her later, she looked up and recognized him instantly. Her eyes widened just slightly, then softened. She didn't say his name. Didn't make a scene. Just gave a small knowing nod as if to say, "I see you, and I'm here because of moments like yours." He returned the nod, kept walking, and felt something shift inside him. Not pride, but connection. This was the real win. Not the contract, not the firings, not even the policy changes. It was this. A young professional standing tall in her role, unshaken by disrespect, because the ground beneath her had finally been leveled. Months later, during a routine audit of his company's travel expenses, his finance lead mentioned in passing that their new airline partner had started including diversity metrics in their quarterly performance reports. On-time service, yes, but also passenger feedback segmented by demographic, crew training completion rates, and equity in meal fulfillment. "They're trying," she said with a half-smile. "Hard," he just nodded. Trying was a start. Sustaining it would be the real test. At home, he rarely talked about work. But one night, over a simple dinner of grilled fish and collard greens, his teenage nephew asked, "Did you really get a whole flight crew fired?" He put his fork down. "No," he said gently. "The airline did. I just asked them to follow their own rules." The boy thought about that for a moment. "Would you do it again?" "In a heartbeat," he said. "Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because if we don't hold systems accountable, they'll keep failing the same people over and over." His nephew nodded slowly, like he was filing the lesson away for later. And maybe he was. Life moved on. Deals closed. Projects launched. Seasons changed. The incident became a footnote in his calendar, but a cornerstone in how his company operated. He hired more aggressively from underrepresented backgrounds. He pushed vendors to disclose their equity practices. He mentored young professionals not with grand speeches, but with quiet opportunities, internships, introductions, second chances, and every time he flew, he noticed the little things. The way attendants now double-checked meal orders against manifests, the way they made eye contact with every passenger regardless of how they dressed, the way service felt consistent, not perfect, but fair. One rainy evening, returning from a site visit in Texas, he found himself seated next to an elderly woman who'd never flown first class before. Her daughter had surprised her with the ticket for her 75th birthday. She was nervous, fumbling with the seat controls, unsure whether she was allowed to ask for a blanket. The flight attendant, a man with kind eyes and a calm voice, knelt beside her, showed her how everything worked, brought her tea without being asked, and treated her like royalty. Watching that exchange, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not because he'd caused it directly, but because the culture was shifting, one interaction at a time. And maybe, just maybe, his small act of insistence had helped tilt the scale. He never sought credit, never needed it. What mattered was that the next person boarding that plane, no matter their skin, their name, or their story, would be met with the same respect, the same meal, the same dignity. As the plane descended into Atlanta, lights blinking through the clouds, he leaned back and closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to breathe. The work wasn't done, It never would be. But tonight the sky felt a little more open, and that was enough.